welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Stephen Poser. He's a practicing psychoanalyst in New York City and the author of The Misfit and Through This Be Madness. Since 2015, he has been a member of the Faculty Psychotherapy Conference of the Department of Psychiatry at Mount Sinai Hospital. And his new book, available April 22nd, is called This Is Me, Is That You? Encounters with Schizophrenia. Stephen, it's a pleasure to have you on, and thank you so much for being with us today.
And thank you both for having me.
Absolutely. And so in his book, Stephen wrote, this book has been more than 25 years in the making. It is derived from nearly illegible notes I scribbled down in a small pocket notebook that I always carried with me during my internship. I typed them up originally as process notes to present to my supervisor at the time, an eccentric, paradoxical, and enigmatic psychoanalyst who had been the protege of Theodor Reich, who himself was a protege of Freud and the author of a famous book entitled Listening with the Third Ear. This kind of psychoanalytic training, with its recognition of the unconscious processes governing and informing the interactions between the analyst and patient, was the foundation of my training. In retrospect, I think there were two fundamental principles that guided me into this experience, both of which go against the view that schizophrenia is a progressively debilitating and incurable brain disease. The first is that the patient's symptoms have meaning, that what they do and what they say can be understood as expressive of all too human fears and wishes, agonies and longings, and are simply not meaningless noise, the word salad produced by a burnt out, neurologically disordered brain. Second, that no matter how deeply the patient has withdrawn into a seemingly impenetrable bubble of solitude, or how much they seem to be living in a private world of hallucinations and delusions, there remains at their core a thinking, feeling human person that might still be brought into a meaningful relationship with the therapist, given enough time, patience, and willingness on both sides. According to these principles, schizophrenia is not a diagnosis of hopelessness, unless all those who might care for the patient have themselves become hopeless. Wow, Stephen, phenomenal writing. Okay, before we even just dive into the conversation about the people involved, I just want to, just because we haven't touched on psychoanalysis in a pretty long time, I would say, on this podcast, can we just get into some core concepts just so our audience understands what we're talking about? So can we talk a little bit about transference, countertransference, active listening, and anything else that you might want to throw in there?
Wow. Well, Leon, what can I say? Well, for those of you who may not know, psychoanalysis was the kind of fundamental beginning of all forms of talk therapy with Freud. And he basically discovered this by treating a woman who was very severely disabled by what he called hysterical symptoms. And he found that if he could just let her talk without interrupting her, that she would somehow come up with memories and feelings and recollections that would somehow relieve her of her symptoms. And so this was the beginning of what he called the technique of free association. So the idea is that as opposed to asking the patient to do something, you basically let the patient talk and you listen and try to follow the the thread of the ideas and images and content as it comes up without imposing any kind of preconceived agenda on what you're trying to accomplish. So with the unconscious, the idea, well, the other big idea in psychoanalysis is that that a large part of what organizes our behavior and our decisions and everything that we do is governed by unconscious processes and motivations and impulses of which we are not aware. And so we're acting out things without really knowing that that's what we're doing. And so the first idea that Freud had was that if you could make the unconscious conscious, you could then relieve the patient of what's disturbing them.
Mm-hmm.
And that was that was sort of the fundamental idea that uh, if you could somehow enable the patient to come to some kind of realization of what it is that they're actually saying or doing,
Mm-hmm.
or what they're afraid of, or what they're what they're stuck with. If you could make them aware of that, then they might actually be freed from the kind of the grip of these kinds of unconscious um, uh, complexes and things that are holding them back or holding them in some kind of grip. Transference is basically the idea that we all impose on others a kind of image or replica of some significant person in the past that has made a big impact on our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, a parent will be the figure that is kind of recreated in the analyst or in any other significant person in your life. Your husband, your wife, your children, your colleagues, you bring, a kind of pre-existing template with you in your encounters with new people in your life. And that's the idea of transference. What's being transferred is the old model onto the new version. And so analysts are typically trained to be aware of how much the patient is recreating um, some pre-existing model in their interactions with you.
Mm-hmm.
And the counterpart of that is that you respond in what's called countertransference by either playing into that or resisting it in some way. It's going to affect you. And so when I said, when you read that business about the unconscious processes that govern the interaction between the patient and the analyst, these are some of the things that I was talking about. So what makes psychoanalytic treatment different than most other forms of psychotherapy is that the analyst will be constantly monitoring his own internal states in response to the patient. And that will in turn inform him about what's going on with the patient. You follow me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a very different, that's a very different model than, for example, any form of behavioral therapy or other forms of uh, yeah, any form of cognitive behavioral therapy for sure. And
Right.
most other forms of therapy that aren't specifically what's called psychodynamic or analytically oriented.
Gotcha. And
I don't
just
want to,
a quick follow-up question to that, just so like, we kind of have a deep understanding of it. So what you're, I think, saying is that instead of, well, not maybe not instead of, maybe in conjunction with, so in conjunction with doing a formal assessment and diagnosis, what you're essentially saying is through the countertransference process, the therapist essentially figures out or understands the dynamics that are going on, the unconscious processes within the patient. So this goes beyond the particular diagnosis. This goes into how they see people, how they relate to people, essentially their fundamental problems that they aren't on a day-to-day basis may be aware of.
that's absolutely correct. And it's important what you point out that diagnosis is really very far from the the kind of ground level interaction with the patient. I mean, I say it in the prologue to the book. I don't know if you remember this, but I really wasn't there to understand how to make all the kind of subtle diagnostic assessments of these patients. And you got to remind people, if you didn't already say this, that this book is based on my experience in the locked ward of a very old mental hospital that no longer exists. And so the patients that I was seeing there were what you might consider to be profoundly ill. They'd been locked up in these places for decades, and so these are not the kinds of patients or people that you would ordinarily encounter in any form of psychotherapy, let alone psychoanalytic therapy. I mean, they were basically warehoused in a place where everything else had failed, and so they weren't getting any form of psychotherapy. And so even the very idea of applying a psychoanalytic form of treatment to this kind of patient is already, kind of an unusual, like what the hell, and I was very privileged and lucky to have that opportunity.
And I was super curious about this when reading. What is it that actually initially drew you to working with patients with schizophrenia in a long-term sort of institutional setting? Like, yeah, what was the impetus for that?
Well, the impetus was that I'd been analyzed and trained and mentored by a group of clinicians, all of whom had had this experience with schizophrenic patients and were very much devoted to understanding how to extend psychoanalytic technique to the treatment of these kinds of profoundly ill psychotic people. And I mean, this is part of the history of psychoanalysis, so I think I might mention it. The extension of psychoanalytic technique to psychotic patients is a relatively recent development in the history of psychoanalysis. Freud started more than 100 years ago with what were called hysterical patients, but they weren't psychotic. They weren't hearing voices. They weren't seeing things that weren't there. They weren't living in a delusional world which they didn't share with anybody. They were more like ordinary people who became depressed or anxious or even obsessional or something or other, but they weren't like this. And so the Freudian idea, at least the classical schools, and Freud himself felt this, that schizophrenic or other psychotic people were not susceptible to the psychoanalytic treatment because they were incapable of forming a transference relationship to the analyst. And what he meant by that was that there was no that they were so delusionally kind of locked into their own weird reality
Right.
that they couldn't they weren't capable of having a transference relation, a realistic transference relationship to the analyst, and so therefore they couldn't be they couldn't participate in a psychoanalytic relationship.
Right.
So he ruled them out from being treated. Now that changed with the advent of Melanie Klein. I think it was in the 1930s. And then the succession of analysts that followed from Klein, like Winnicott and Bion and so forth, and in the British object relations and so forth. So, so the way I got into this is because the people who I was training with had come along, and in that second wave of interest in the psychotic patients, and so that's basically the answer. I know. So not only was I analyzed by such clinicians, but I was also teaching and supervising and teaching. I also taught clinical writing for a number of years. So what can I say? So there were certain elements of that training that applied to these kinds of patients most particularly, wouldn't ordinarily apply to an ordinary psychotherapeutic relationship. Like, for example, what's it like to be with someone who is not capable of recognizing another object, another external person who's real? That is something that most of us don't really ordinarily encounter. But that's one of the things you have to be aware of, that a lot of these people, at least for part of the time, are in what you might call an objectless state. That is, you can be sitting with them and you feel like you're just not being recognized at all. I mean, you're like you're like an inert object. You're not being recognized. You're not being acknowledged. They don't respond to you. It's like you're not even there. And that is something you have to learn how to tolerate and recognize and understand.
Yeah. And what I love so much about it, especially in the context of your writing, obviously, is that with psychoanalysis, it's sort of couched in what I would say, not necessarily so, but I feel like there's a sort of an implicit connection here, that it feels like it's sort of couched in evolutionary theory. And here's what I mean by that. So when you think of nature as as a sort of a cohesive system, more or less, not to say that it's guided by any sort of hand or anything like that, but it seems like for the most part, a lot of it does make sense. So what I love about the psychoanalytic framework is schizophrenia, or just psychosis in general, that there's a rhyme and reason to it. So whereas you have, let's say, somebody else on the outside looking in, the thinking is, well, none of this makes sense, as you mentioned, they called it the disordered brain, etc. But for you, and especially again in the work, you think of these things symbolically, and then also you think of these things in terms of defenses. So what purpose does this serve for this person? So on the one hand, you have something along the lines of, again, in symbolic thinking, you have an understanding of trauma, right? Like all of this is a sort of representation of it, that essentially these visions and these kind of memories and maybe these sort of in vivo experiences that are more or less mental, obviously, it feels as though the person is sort of kind of enacting and experiencing things in a way that maybe feels, let's say, more or less tolerable to them, right? Maybe in other ways it wouldn't have been. And then in addition to that, you have these defenses where you have, like, let's say, the paranoia that you spoke about, which we'll definitely get into. And the paranoia serves as a kind of mechanism for deeper pain and anguish. And so what makes this not only just so unique but so important is the fact that if we can kind of, what you're saying is essentially, if we can make sense of this, not only just for the person who's in treatment and the person who's experiencing the agony, but for the outsider looking in, if we can make sense of this for us and for them, maybe to whatever extent that's possible, there's this deep connection waiting for all of us. And so what I now want to get into is now getting into the specifics. Let's actually now start with the stories, right? Let's get into some of the symbolism behind the person you labeled as Agnes. Tell us a little bit about the background background there. Tell us a little bit about the work together, and what is it that you found to be symbolic about that person's representations?
Wow. Well, it seems like you really are getting it, Leon. So I've got to compliment you on that. Yes, the symbolic part is absolutely important. I mean, I can tell you right away in the very first interaction with this woman. Well, not the very first, but the first long interaction I had with this woman was when she'd been kept upstairs on the ward and not permitted to come down for what was to be a so-called mental health class because she'd had an episode of running amok on the ward the day before and had to be put in restraints because she was liable to hurt herself, which she'd done before.
Mm.
And so when I saw her, they asked me if I wanted to see her. And I said I did. And so when I got up there, she was dressed in a sheet. She had two attendants, one on either side of her. I sat her down on a couch. They gave her a paper cup filled with milk. And I can tell you what she said. I mean, I want you to hear this because it is so outrageously psychotic that, no one could possibly pretend to understand what she was really talking about. But I want to give you the idea of how I responded to her, because that'll tell you a lot. So, see this right here. So I'm just going to read a little bit.
Yeah, please.
Please.
So I sit down with her on the couch. She looks like a broken doll. Her infant. Now this woman spoke in the voice of a nursery school child. She was 46 years old, but when she spoke, it was like, I don't know if you've ever seen some of these puppets from the 50s, like a ventriloquist puppet or something. But she sounded like a nursery school child. Very high-pitched kind of infantile voice that she had all the time. And so her voice is charged with urgency, panic, and terror. She says she filled the entire bathroom with menstrual blood, and there was a cord around her neck from a Cabbage Patch doll that would have taken her head off if she hadn't managed to remove it herself in the toilet. And she showed me her neck where the wound was. There is no wound. She tells me she's terribly frightened of dolls. She shows me other non-existent wounds, one in her hand from running a sewing needle through her finger, and the other on her feet, which she says are deformed baby feet, and that she has to wear braces and special Buster Brown shoes in order to walk, and that she has been bitten by a shark when she was a baby swimming in the ocean. But her mother didn't recognize it or didn't believe it when she told her. And then she said that she was telling me the truth. And I haven't said anything yet. I'm just listening to this. So she tells me that she's telling me the truth. And I say, I believe you.
Yeah.
That's the very first thing I said to her after like 40 minutes of this. Then she takes a few sips of milk and gradually becomes less agitated. And I asked her if she would like to continue seeing me on a regular basis, and she says she would. And then she repeats that she's telling the truth. And then I repeat that I believe her. 45 minutes have transpired, and she sits calmly sipping her milk. I tell her that we have to stop now, and that I will see her next week. I thank her for talking and get up to leave. On the way out, I see the nurse. She says there are a few things I should know about Agnes. She's diagnosed as a schizophrenic, disorganized type. Her biography includes the information that at the age of 2, she fell down a flight of stairs in a baby carriage, and in the accident, her mother was killed. All right. Now, you got a trauma of a magnitude that most of us couldn't possibly comprehend.
Mm-hmm.
And now she's 46 years old, and she's still somehow falling down the stairs endlessly and forever.
Right.
And so when she says all these terrible things that have happened to her, I'm hearing it, I don't know what it's actually symbolizing, but I'm hearing it, as symbolic. And so then when she tells me she's telling me the truth, and I say I believe you, I meant it.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't just playing games.
Mm-hmm.
I meant it. Because I think when she said, I'm telling you the truth, that was a real communication from her to me, which was not in the same register as the other psychotic material. That was a kind of reaching out for some kind of a recognition of the reality of what she was trying to communicate. And so that's a psychoanalytic response. I think that's a paradigmatically psychoanalytic response for me to say, I believe you. I mean, you're going to believe what she told you? Well, only if you can hear it as a very human and anguished expression of terror and a kind of overwhelmingly devastating fear and anguish, and I mean, it's almost unspeakable. Anyway, so that's some kind of an answer to your question, I think.
Of course, and honestly, I think that displays a true attempt to really seek to understand what is the reality like for Agnes in this particular
Yeah.
context, because everyone else is at odds with her reality. Says, no, you're not here. This is no, that didn't happen. You're making things up, or just ignores them. Just come with me, come to your room.
Right.
Okay, you have to eat. Here's your milk. That sort of relationship, that dynamic.
Right.
But actually saying, no, I believe you. Not just saying it, right? But just as you just said, really meaning it, because you want to see what it is that they're seeing. You believe that that's what she's experiencing, right? And even as you note in the book, yeah, she actually started to calm down a bit. It's not like it cured her, right? But at least that affirming of her reality, being one of the few, if not the only person who might actually do that, actually builds that rapport, creates that connection, or at least begins to foster that connection and allows for maybe deeper communication to occur. Who
Well, that
knows where
was the
that leads,
beginning.
but
That was the beginning of a relationship, which lasted for 2 years.
Mm.
And uh, it was part of my idea, and I've written about this elsewhere, that, I mean, the big milestone in any form of treatment, but particularly with somebody who starts out in such a alienated and and um, and with uh, and withdrawn state, from any form of, authentic human interaction,
Mhm.
that when you get them to be, when you get them from a state of being completely kind of autistically enclosed in some kind of cocoon of some kind, to being oriented to you as an external object, that is the beginning of the relationship.
Mhm.
That's the beginning of the therapeutic alliance. And if you read Winnicott, he also describes this moment in the life of the infant as it becomes aware of its mother as an external reality which is separate from itself.
Mhm.
That's another moment of huge significance in the unfolding of the mind. So if you can think of the treatment progression of a psychotic person, it's not, it's parallel to the birth of a human mind from the point of a kind of unconscious fetal embryonic
Mm.
state of being basically mindless to being engaged with another external person in the form of the mother, and in my case, in the form of the analyst with
Mhm.
the patient.
Wow.
So from there, you can start to see that the idea of relationship becomes primary.
Right.
Yeah,
And
that
so,
becomes
and then
primary.
And then, so I'm sure a lot of listeners listening to this, especially ones oriented to psychoanalysis, would have this question, maybe to some extent. But I think that they would wonder, okay, so let's say in the normal course of therapy, somebody would come in, they would say, okay, this is what I'm going through. And the analyst and the client would essentially develop treatment goals. And so the understanding is all of the sessions after the fact, they're in service of those treatment goals. But then when you're working on a ward, most of the time, if not all of the time, many of these people don't necessarily want to be in treatment. And then obviously, as you mentioned with another case, there is often a lot of aggression and hostility. So what sort of course does treatment take in that respect, where treatment goals not only are not set, but it seems maybe even antithetical to set those treatment goals because they sort of foster and feed the hostility?
You mean in the ordinary course of doing psychotherapeutic work as an analyst?
Yeah,
Uh,
so with people with psychotic disorders, yeah.
oh, well, with psychotic disorders, it's different. I mean, I've had a number of people as outpatients
Hmm.
for extended period of time. And I mean, people want to live uh, treatment goals. I mean, I think the treatment goals are the same as everybody else. I want to have I want to have, I'm sorry, I
No.
want to have a decent relationship with my partner.
Yep.
I want to, I want to be able to get along with my parents. I, 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 I don't know how I'm going to, survive if I lose this job.
Hmm.
Um, you know, I don't know what treatment goals are when people first come in.
Hmm.
I,
Okay.
I want them to basically tell me what they ought to be.
Hmm.
And then I want to be able to help them to find their own truth, to
Hmm.
find their own emotional, um, reality in,
Hmm.
in whatever situation they're facing. And when people come in, you know, they're ordinarily they don't come in for nothing. They come in because they're very upset or something terrible has happened.
Hmm.
So we got to figure out like what is that? And how can we sort of stabilize your life in such a way that we can begin to do some psychotherapeutic work?
Mm.
And so once I get a kind of handle on it, and then I don't think it's that different. I want to learn how to listen to somebody,
Mm.
And I'm going to listen on as many different levels with as many different, modalities of thought and experience and as I can bring to it. And then when I think I have something to say, I'm going to say it,
Mm.
or I'll ask a question. And if I can get the person to start telling me the story uh, of the significant moments of their life, either in the past or in the present, or even in the future, then then things are going to go well. If the person doesn't know how to be able to begin to talk, you have to help them to learn how to talk.
I love that so much. And so now, as we're kind of moving on through the book, so now I want to get into Mrs. Lutzky. And so
Yeah,
I want to actually, so now couched in this case and in the person, obviously, I want you to actually now tell us a little bit about, okay, so you're having your beginning treatment with this person, right? So normally speaking, with somebody who is pretty aggressive and who's pretty hostile, paranoid, etc. Let's say if there is a therapist somewhere out there who would want to set initial treatment goals, that initially wouldn't work because the understanding is if you try to set treatment goals with them, they would more or less feel like you're controlling them and even trying to manipulate them. So can you now getting into this case, and you could take this as far as you're willing to go and want to go. Can you actually tell us how that began, right? How was that for you in trying to understand and form a relationship, a bond with her? How was that for you kind of dealing with some of the hostility, some of the bit of, not even a bit, but some anti-Semitism, obviously. So what was that experience like for you, and what did you feel like was important for you to develop that relationship with her?
oh well, I mean, I can tell you how it started.
Mm.
um yeah, I put, that's the very first thing I put here for her.
Hmm.
um okay, so this is the first interaction I ever had with this woman.
Hmm.
um Now you got an older middle-aged woman.
Mm.
Her hair's already turned gray.
Hmm.
She's wearing a raggy dress from the wardrobe shop, and she's got a thick New York Jewish accent,
Hmm.
a lot of Yiddish thrown in.
Hmm.
So the nurse is giving a class called Mental and Physical Health. The topic for discussion is mind and body. The nurse is telling the patients that they have both a mind and a body.
Mm.
Hillary, another patient, says, I'm a mind without a body. Mrs. Lutzky, an older-looking woman with a thick Yiddish accent, confronts me from across the room.
Mm.
Why don't you strangle me for good? Throw me out the window. She continues exclaiming to me about Moe in Williamsburg, how they serve schnapps in the restaurant, that the food here is poison, and they put bleach in the shampoo, and that's why her hair is ruined. And then she keeps going. Why don't you just throw me out the window? I know you. You killed my mother, broke her bones. You're a human meat grinder. You and Mo, everybody wants to be a Hitler. You'll get yours. You'll die like an animal. This goes on for about 5 minutes. I'm not saying anything. Finally, she stops and I say, thanks a lot. That's the first thing I said to
Hmm.
her. Then the nurse hears all this going on and says, that's not a very nice thing to say. Dr. Poser is our new psychology intern. He's going to be with us for a while. So she says, all right already. I'm sorry. Okay. And then she just walks away. So with the so the answer is the first thing, I didn't take it. I just let her, vent Because I didn't think I was going to get hurt, you know. I mean, she wasn't going to assault me or anything.
Hmm.
She's just, you know, she's never seen me before in her life. And I killed her mother, and I'm going to die like an animal.
Hmm.
So I, I kind of treated it almost like see, she's some kind of a character in a comedy show or something, you know. I didn't take her seriously.
Mm.
Said thanks a lot, you know, the way you might say to some other person who you can be a little bit playful with. And so that was my way with her, is to try to, I never confronted it. I never retaliated against her. Um, I tried to be as playful and as comical with her as I could get away with.
Mm.
And I found, to my great delight, that it worked. You know, I could get her off these these um, these paranoid rants and very highly detailed fantasies of hers by just kind of out crazying her a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, I'll tell you, I remember one time, see if I can find this, uh, give you an idea.
Hmm.
Um, uh,
Oh, could I
yes,
mention this very quickly? Just, I have to say, one of my favorite parts was when she called you Dr. Mengele.
yeah,
And
Dr. Mengele, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah. Oh, I remember one thing. Oh,
I mean, saying that Hitler was polite at home was quite notable.
right. He was great. Yeah, he could play basketball or
Yeah, I was married to Hitler. You should have seen him ice skate better than Sonja Heine. Uh-huh.
right. Looking for the business where she um, oh, I don't want to hold this up.
It's okay.
Anyway, yeah, I got her
Well, you did mention that her delusions were a defense mechanism, so that would be pretty important to touch
yeah.
on.
No, she at one point she was insisting that she'd been hit in the head with a hammer.
Mm.
That and I asked her to bend over so I could have a look at it. And I told her that she was right, that she did get hit by something, but I didn't think it was a hammer. I
Hmm.
think it was a meatball.
Hmm.
I kept insisting with her that she got hit in the head with a meatball
Hmm.
Yeah.
until she got so frustrated with me that she just changed the subject and started ordering food out of the air.
Mm.
Got into my taking orders for her in a restaurant. We,
Hmm.
we I changed it into a game. That's what I did with her,
Hmm.
and it seemed to work. I'm looking for the one place where uh, she was telling me about Sesame Street with the Miss Piggy, but I can't find it right now. Um, anyway, I got her to tell me I was crazy.
Hmm.
Every time I got her to tell me I was crazy,
Hmm.
I thought, this is good.
Mm.
This is good. Because, um, you know, I never got her to give up these delusional ideas.
Right. You mentioned they were rigid.
But as far as the defense is concerned, I got the feeling that they were a very brittle but necessary defense that she'd had against feelings which were even more devastating, like being abandoned by her family,
Yeah.
like being hopelessly uh, uh, with prevented from having any expectable normal life outside the hospital.
Mm.
Like, nobody wanted her. Everybody found her, repulsive or impossible. And she
Mhm.
was an impossible person. And so I can imagine that, whatever, family she might have had in the past would have felt that they just couldn't handle her and they
Mhm.
gave her up. I
Mm.
mean, I didn't go into the details of these histories because I didn't feel I didn't want to know too much.
Mm.
But yeah, I think that that was a defense against a kind of existential despair.
Mm.
Yeah,
And when you came to the assessment that they became or that they were rigid, how did you come to that? How did you realize that they were pretty intractable for whatever reason?
because uh, because anytime anything would contradict them,
Hmm.
she'd immediately change the subject and
Mm.
leave the topic altogether. Um, she also was capable of going into a catatonic state
Mm. Mm.
I think when the stimulation got even more intense, that was her last resort of kind of evacuating herself from the here and now.
Hmm.
And that would and she'd get up and she'd stand in front of the windows and let the sunlight come on her. She'd hold her dress up so the sunlight could come on her body. Sometimes she'd get into a strange posture and just stand there in it, for a while, like long time, 15, 20 minutes, I don't know, maybe half an hour, like that, motionless. And so she had um the I interpreted this. These are mechanisms to defend herself from otherwise being somehow overwhelmed and annihilated by thoughts or feelings that were just un unbearably painful.
Mm.
And that's why, I couldn't. I mean, that's why I felt like I had comedy. I could make her laugh. I could make her smile.
Hmm.
Nobody else could do that. And it gave her some relief. If I tried to take away the other stuff, by confronting it or trying to prove that that these were just, crazy, wrong ideas, then she would have had nothing.
Mm.
She'd be confronted with being a 40 some odd year old woman locked up in a in a kind of what do you want to call it, back ward of a old mental hospital with no one who visits her and nowhere to go and
Yeah.
nothing to look forward to. I mean, that's a pretty tragic life, you know. I don't think these women are alive.
Mm.
Something I wanted to ask you about. So of course, we all want to. I definitely want to bring up Lucia 100%. But I wanted to ask your opinion on something. Prior to to us starting the podcast, I mentioned very briefly, that no two people with schizophrenia, maybe definitely not as acute. Like they're not in facilities and institutions long term, nothing like that. there was something and this is probably wrong of me. I'm no psychoanalyst, but this one particular person who hears voices, like let's say I'm speaking to them on the phone, they'll say they heard a voice telling them something negative about themselves, uh, some such thing, right? So when I was talking to this person, everyone else who from that knows this person would tell them, "You're imagining things. You're not hearing that. Go to the doctor. Or take these pills to dampen these symptoms." Uh, so essentially, I wanted to be different about it, right? So kind of just like you, um, I said something along the lines of, "No, I believe you." That kind of thing, right? And okay, we seem to be going along a good path there. Then because I didn't know how to handle this situation, right? Or could it even be handled? It's just something that must probably be embraced and sort of surrendered to, perhaps. But I had a little bit of influence from Eastern philosophy, like being present to the moment, concepts such as like ego, like identifying with thoughts, belief, that sort of thing. So I attempted this other approach where, we were talking about what ego is, at least, from that perspective. Of course, there's different working definitions depending on the discipline. So we talk about that, and I was like, so, okay, so what about if when you hear that other voice, you kind of other it? Because this person was pretty lucid. They were lucid enough to
Yeah.
have this level of discussion. So I was like, okay, what do you think about, when you hear that voice, you don't believe it or you don't believe in it, or this is not you, or this, that kind of thing. I thought this would have been, a eureka, sort of a breakthrough thing, but that was a little, I think, naive. Probably the real approach might have been to more maybe embrace that other voice, still keeping along the lines of not just I believe you, but okay, and then what else is the voice saying? Okay. And then maybe going somewhere with that. I don't know. But based on this little tidbit that I just gave, what are your thoughts when you hear someone trying to approach it that way, like mentioning things like ego and maybe not paying attention to this other voice? Does that probably sound wrong to you?
Well, is this on the telephone you're talking to this person?
And the particular situation I'm describing, yes, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because I don't know. I mean, you know, the real getting better um, is when the patient can talk about just ordinary, you know, ordinary kinds of day-to-day little stuff, like what they had for breakfast and what are they going to do this afternoon and what,
Wow.
you know, and not about, the detailed content of these things. I had a woman who I saw, for about 6 years that came to my office, and she would sometimes be hearing voices, and she heard like 12 different voices,
Wow.
and they had characters, the devil, and I don't, there were different voices. She could even hear birds
Mm-hmm.
talking to
Mm-hmm.
her.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but um, I would kind of wait it out and see if she would come back into a more, interpersonal reality with me. Um, if she was, so if this person is hearing voices while he's talking to you,
Hmm.
then the ordinary psychiatrist will say, well, what are they saying? And then they'll tell you. Um, he tells me, um, I'm I'm a piece of shit, I'm
Yeah.
terrible, I'm a whore, or I'm gonna die, or something about how bad I am.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Um, and then um, it's not going to help to to ask them, well, why? why would somebody say that to you?
Hmm.
You know, because as far as I'm concerned, you're not any of those things. You're a decent fellow,
Hmm.
you know. That's not going to help, I don't think. The the thought uh, that occurs to most therapists is that these voices don't come out of nowhere. They're either a part of the patient talking to himself, or they're somebody else, you know, in their life
Mhm.
telling them how bad they are. And so you'd have to really get a sense of the person. Um, it's a tough question. I don't know um, if talking about anything philosophical would be a meaningful response.
Well,
That's fair.
I
That's
actually
totally fair.
love that answer so much because I feel as though it tailors into and ties into so many of the other aspects, or not necessarily aspects, but the therapy, the types of therapy, or however you want to kind of frame it, the versions of therapy with other types of patients, rather. So if you think about, let's say, somebody who's narcissistic and you think about grandiosity, so an example of that would be something in terms of therapy would be tying the person and weaving them back into the fabric of life, where they're no longer above it all, where they're thinking, my life has to be extraordinary and I have to feel important. It's actually getting the person to feel okay about the ordinariness of it, to talk about the day to day, people they're going to see, things that they're going to do, the ways that they probably don't matter so much on that scale in the world. So that's why I love that answer so much. And I would have
Well,
never thought,
it's an achievement, you know. It takes
yeah.
time, you know, to get them to there. But you know, you can't do these these kinds of look. Psychoanalysis or any form of therapy of this kind is aiming to produce a real change in psychic structure,
Hmm.
aiming to produce a real transformational change in this person, which is not simply a matter of just making the symptoms go away.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Something more profound than that, and it takes a lot of time and continuity over time.
Hmm.
It takes a sustained engagement with the practitioner to be able to get to that level of trust and of safety
Hmm.
with the therapist, that these kinds of um, changes can occur, because first of all, the defenses have to be relaxed.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And what I say in the prologue to the book is that my first objective is to make the person feel safe, and that they can trust me not to do anything which will aggravate them, enrage them, threaten them,
Hmm.
invade them, or do anything to them.
Hmm.
Um, well, like I said in the thing, I'm not trying to do anything to the person. I'm trying to become something for the person.
Wow, I love that so much.
Yeah. And that is a matter of being much more transparent and receptive to their material. In other words, not being defended yourself
Yeah.
against how awful and horrible they could make you feel,
Hmm.
or even how scared they could make you. And
Hmm.
you got to be able to kind of control your own um, uh, receiving process well enough not to be able to, not to, to, not to defend yourself against them. In other words, you know, and with a paranoid person, you can feel you can feel, you can feel their hostility
Hmm.
and their anger and their rage
Mhm.
sometimes. And that's a hard thing to do. But my answer is that, yeah, if you can get them to the ordinary, then you really got them back into the world on a much less kind of distorted paranoid basis
I love that.
or even psychotic basis.
And so, speaking of the ordinary, and this is going to be one of our final questions as we start to wrap up. So, speaking of the ordinary, so Irv Yalom had this saying of throw-ins, right? He would call them, he would say there are these aspects of therapy, these very ordinary human experiences that are not necessarily part of any treatment manual, and they have to be authentic for them to actually work, and they have to be spontaneous, more importantly. So, for you, in any of these particular, let's say, moments, experiences, what were some of your throw-ins? What were these sort of more human moments of connection that actually helped you see? That for whatever reason and however they connected with the person, and obviously I don't want to use the term healed them, but in some ways they made them feel like as though that they were sort of more human themselves, that they were seen, they were heard. And in particular, I really want to ask this question: can you actually tell us about the staircase? Because to me that actually seemed like a pivotal moment in the book.
You mean
taking Yeah,
walking
you.
down the stairs?
That
It
was excellent.
was.
It was
It
excellent.
was.
So mundane but so beautiful.
Well, I got to preface this by saying that, this woman was absolutely terrified of going down the stairs. She wouldn't even leave the ward because she didn't want to get raped in the elevator. She didn't want she didn't want to fall down the stairs or throw herself to her death. And so she wouldn't even leave the ward, let alone go down the stairs. And so the one time that we this happened before the final party, but one time everybody went out. They had smoking breaks every few hours. You could, if you wanted to have a cigarette, they let you out. This was the old days when you could smoke, right? Schizophrenic patients like smoking. I mean, what else can you do? So anyway, she wouldn't go out. So I said, all right, if she's not going out, I'm just going to stay here the whole time. Let everybody else go. I'm going to stay here the whole time. So I plopped myself down in a chair, and she's, like half a room away. And I just stayed there the whole time. And once in a while, she'd look over at me, and I, kind of nodded. I didn't say anything. I didn't do anything. So that was that. Now, when the party came along, and I was leaving, the elevator was broken. So we had to go down the stairs, and she wasn't going to go. I said, well, what if I went with you? And we went real slow, and you could stop whenever you wanted to. And so I offered her my hand, and she took it. And so we went down the stairs one step at a time, and when she stopped, she said, don't push me. I said, okay, I'm not pushing you. And so finally we did get down the stairs, and then we did it a few more times over the course of those 2 years. Now, she never really left the building, but she was able to go to another floor of where they kept birds in bird cages.
Wow.
So they gave her the job of feeding the birds and cleaning their cages. And so she would go up there. She had a job now, and this was a big deal.
Yep.
I mean, with all of them, I think I managed to create a reality, a new dimension to their lives, which had not been there before, because they just hadn't, they didn't have anybody to talk to, and they were extremely lonely people. So yeah, walking Agnes down the stairs was one of the high points, for sure. Yeah.
I love that. I love
And
that. Mhm.
and with Lucia, there were a number of other kinds of high points, different.
Okay. Can you get into them too? We have a little bit of
This
time.
was a
I'm
woman
so
who,
happy you
oh,
asked.
Mhm.
Thank you.
oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, yeah. Can you get into? Yeah, we still have a little bit of time. So with Lucia.
So Lucia was the last person in the book.
Hmm.
And like I've said to other people, um, the book is a kind of trilogy.
Hmm.
And the first part is a tragedy.
Hmm.
It's Agnes. The second part is a comedy.
Hmm.
That's Mrs. Lutzky.
Hmm.
Third part is a love story,
Hmm.
and that's Lucia.
Hmm.
Now, Lucia is a very unusual woman. She, first of all, was a vivid, uh, she had visual hallucinations, not just auditory hallucinations, but she
Hmm.
would actually see things.
Hmm.
She would see stitches on my face. She would see that I was crying when she was crying.
Wow.
She had um, she had claimed to have given birth to all the other patients on the ward as her own children. She'd redid her own parents
Hmm.
as still as children, which she would rock on her breast, hallucinated her own mother and father as her babies.
Wow.
I mean, it was wildly original. I
Hmm.
mean, this uh now she also spoke to me, and here we talk about transference, um, as though I were her father, her baby boy, her husband, the father of her imaginary children,
Wow. Yeah.
her doctor, and um, and I had reciprocal feelings toward her. I mean, I experienced her sometimes as my mother,
Hmm.
sometimes as my daughter, no, not my daughter so much, um, as my patient, my analyst, my colleague, because I would ask her to help me with other patients. I mean, she
Hmm.
became something for me, which was unusual and unique.
Hmm.
Now, the most devastating fact about this whole thing was that in the second year of my tenure on the ward, my mother got diagnosed with a possible lesion in her ovary and had to go in for an exploratory surgery.
Hmm.
Um, and so this happened, I think, in early December. During that time, I was sitting with Lucia one time, and she goes, "How much for the funeral?"
Wow.
I first of all, I never spoken to
Right.
her about my mother. Second of all, I had no inkling at that point that my mother was going to die.
Wow.
But in fact, like 3 or 4 weeks later, she did die.
Hmm.
I came back to the hospital and I was in a weird state. I felt like, now I'm in my house, my asylum. This is my refuge.
Hmm.
And Lucia then took over and sat with me for long periods of time in absolute silent communion.
Wow.
So this relationship was very, very powerful. Um, there were other things she seemed to know about my family, which I had no idea how she knew.
Hmm.
She knew my daughter's name. She knew my grandfather was had a full head of hair. She knew Um, what else did she know? She knew my father had polio.
Mm.
I mean, how do you, this is uncanny. So, you meet people in these places that you would never, ever encounter in the world.
Hmm.
I mean, it was a unique experience in my life.
Yeah, wow. So amazing. Okay, Alan, before we wrap up, any final questions for Stephen about anything?
Yes. This is a pleasure, by the way. I just want to ask if we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course, buy the book, where can we do that?
Well, it's called This Is Me, Is That You? And it's on Amazon. It's on Yale University Press website, but they have all the links to all the other places where you can get it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, for anybody out there who's interested, I'd love to hear your thoughts when and if you do get a chance to read it.
Mm. And
And
Alan, you should say on the podcast what you said before, what you thought about the work.
Oh, well, yeah, no, of course. For any of our audience out there, I just want to say this definitely for me personally was a very emotionally impactful book. Reminded me, it might be because of my own personal experiences, but not even just that. Honestly, the times where there's just the connection, sometimes humor, sometimes just actually just seeing a profound, really incredibly deep bond forming, especially with Lucia. It's it makes you feel things just from reading it. There's
mm,
different sort of perspectives that you can approach this book from when you're reading it as far as that goes. And I think this is very universally impactful and will connect with a lot of people.
And
Yeah.
Stephen, I would also just add to that, this book is everything that I think all of us hope for therapy to be.
well, gee, with that, I can't say how much I am grateful to both of you for having me. And um, yeah, thanks. Thanks
Ab-
very much. And
Absolutely.
don't, and any of your readers or people who, want to, you feel free to forward them my email or whatever they might like to have.
Ab- Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Stephen, again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Okay,
Absolutely.
thank you both.
Take
Absolutely.
care.
We'll talk to you soon.
Okie dokie. Bye.
Bye.
That was amazing. All right. So, everyone, as you know, if you'd like to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe,
Hit the
hit the
bell
bell
on
on YouTube.
YouTube.
And again, thank you so much for watching and see you next time.